Step into the unknown with Paranormal M, the channel that brings you tales that will leave you questioning everything. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss out on any of our latest stories. Let's get lost in the mystery. Electronic Anomaly at Tragedy House. I'll have to leave some major details vague in this story, so please forgive the lack of specifics. I can't risk anyone identifying the location or guessing the people associated with the story. My boss called me yesterday afternoon while I was driving home. He said that he had to tell me something weird that happened at the job site. Background: we had installed some network equipment at a big house. When I was there, I got a really strange feeling. It was an older house that seemed overdue for updates. It also seemed a bit neglected. I was unsettled and confused. I just couldn't put my finger on the reasons why. I later found out that something bad happened there. Something very bad, tragic and heartbreaking. That is as specific as I can be. The day before yesterday, we got an automated monitoring alert that a piece of equipment we installed had failed. Our guess was that it had been overheated or that it got wet or shorted out. It was all brand new, so we assumed that the cause of the failure was environmental somehow. I was busy elsewhere, so my boss got there about a day after it had failed. He found that the equipment was fine, but that it was simply powered off. It was attached to a power distribution unit, a PDU, and the PDU is connected to the network and has power outlets that can be remotely controlled. This is commonly used so that if a piece of equipment is malfunctioning, it can be rebooted remotely, which often resolves the problem. This particular piece of equipment was connected to a power cycle only power outlet on the PDU, meaning that the power outlet does not ever stay powered off, but will only blink the power off briefly before resuming normal operation. The device wasn't working because the power outlet that it was connected to had turned off, which it shouldn't ever do if the PDU was working correctly. My boss assumed that the PDU had somehow failed. He sat there staring at the PDU while contemplating his next course of action. While he was staring directly at it, the red LED on the PDU electrical outlet suddenly turned on. The connected equipment turned on and resumed normal operation. It had been powered off for a whole day and suddenly came back on by itself while he was staring at it. He told the client what happened and said he had no explanation for it. He jokingly said, "It's haunted." The client accepted that calmly and said, "That kind of thing happens here all the time." The client had previously told us that the house makes them very uncomfortable and they don't like being there. I heard someone whisper, "Learn from this," in my ear. Last night I was watching a movie about making the most of your life and the people who are in it with my ex, who I'm friends with, at around 8 a.m. Around the end of the movie, the lead actress was talking about how we shouldn't be cooped up in our shallow dreams and instead concentrate on people who are in our lives and we're lucky to have. The accomplishments we've made for ourselves and that we should be grateful for. After she finished her sentence, I heard a male voice whisper, "You should take a lesson from this," in my ear. My mother tongue is Turkish, so I heard this in Turkish. There is no way my ex whispered this to me because his mouth was stuffed when I heard it. I've been feeling kinda lost and out of place in life for a bit now, trying to find where I fit in and which one of my dreams I should be pursuing, and where I would be most happy. So really interesting that I heard something like this. It feels as though I got contact with some higher energy. Plus, this is the first time I've experienced something paranormal. I know it sounds small, but it had an impact on me. And icing on the top, 2 to 3 minutes later, my mom knocked on my door and asked me, if I was the one who knocked on her door, whilst I was in the middle of a movie. On December 24th, 2020, I was found by my close friend Tim on the floor of my bedroom. I was a very unhealthy shade of blue, not breathing and completely unresponsive. Tim had come to my house after getting a bad feeling after I had failed to answer his repeated phone calls and texts. This was completely unlike me, and Tim knew that something was wrong. Upon arrival to my apartment, he found my bedroom door locked. Thankfully, he kicked it in. I was unconscious, without a pulse, and not breathing. He called 911 and gave me CPR until the ambulance arrived. I was in a medically induced coma for 2.5 months. It was the most terrifying 2.5 months of my whole life. On November 4th, 2018, I went to the Feather River Hospital in Paradise, California, where I had been living for the previous 15 years with my wife Amita. I had been feeling flu-like symptoms and had decided that I'd better be seen. The hospital sent me home with codeine cough syrup. Amita knew that that was something worse than what the doctors had thought, and insisted that I go to the Enloe Hospital down the hill in Chico for a second opinion. Thankfully, I listened to her because they told me that an abscessed tooth had infected my heart and lungs with endocarditis. They said that I needed immediate open heart surgery or I would die. They then told me that I had about a 20% chance of making it with surgery and I'd better say my goodbyes to my wife. I was devastated and completely scared to death. I asked my then best friend Kenny to keep an eye on Amita, told her that I would go back and I would fight for my life. It was November 6th, 2018 when I was admitted to Enloe Hospital in Chico, California. On November 8th, 2018, I got to watch it on live TV, our home burning down, along with the whole town of Paradise. It was called The Campfire, and it completely burned the whole town of Paradise down, along with our home, my business, our cars, cats, 8 friends that got burned alive in their cars trying to evacuate, and everything that we both owned in this world. My heart condition had not only saved my life, but had made me go to Chico and thus missed by the fire. Had I been there in Paradise, I would have been burned alive trying to save my inventory of computers and electronics. I ended up in Enloe Hospital for 46 days while they gave me 3 open heart surgeries, replacing my heart valve with a mechanical heart valve, implanting a pacemaker, and giving me 2 full blood transfusions. They also gave me 46 days of antibiotics, 3 IV bags every 2 hours. When I go out of the hospital and went to my first place my ex and my ex-best friend were camping out at, I discovered that Kenny was doing more than keeping an eye on her. They were sleeping together as well. Devastated and with a broken heart in more ways than one, I filed for a divorce and hopped on a train to Salt Lake City, the city I was born in. Well, fast forward to December 2020. My friend Tim kicked open my bedroom door to my new apartment in Salt Lake City, Utah, starting CPR until the ambulance had gotten there. My mechanical heart valve had gotten reinfected as well as my pacemaker, making it necessary for the doctors to put me in a coma, to replace the mechanical heart valve with a pig valve and the pacemaker as well. What follows is the most terrifying experience of my entire life, and my only afterlife experience. I felt that it was necessary to give the background of why I was put into a coma and what I experienced during it. Of course, I don't remember anything leading up to when Tim kicked in the door and found me. When I became aware of my surroundings, I was strapped down on my back on a rolling gurney. I was being pushed by 2 attendees and were in hospital scrubs, white or drab white in color, and their faces and hair were totally covered by masks and caps. Only visible were their eyes. I will refer to them as orderlies, because that's what I felt they were. When I became aware of what was going on, these 2 orderlies were pushing me on the gurney, down a long corridor. What was strange was that the corridor or hallway was extremely long, By extremely long, I mean miles long. They were pushing me for hours in a straight line down one corridor that went on for miles. Then they would stop, looking down at me, and one of them would ask me, "Do you know where you are?" Then, "Do you know what is happening to you?" I replied, "No, where am I? What is going on?" The orderlies would not answer. They just checked the straps and held me down and would continue pushing me down these impossibly long corridors. They would stop every once in a while and open a sliding door that opened on another long corridor. The hallways were a drab gray color and smelled like old dusty warehouse. We would come to junctions, and there I realized that something was very much amiss. In these junctions, it seemed that they opened up into a kind of labyrinth. Not a normal sight at all, but a lot like an Escher painting, where there were other orderlies, some dressed in all black scrubs, while others dressed in gray or blue or green, all in full-face mask coverings and caps that only showed their eyes. These other orderlies were walking upside down on the ceiling, heading towards other corridors that branched off in several different directions. Some were pushing gurneys like the one which I was strapped, while others walked alone or in pairs. They never acknowledged my presence or spoke directly at me, except for asking me occasionally if I knew where I was or what was going on. This continued for days and days, changing directions occasionally or opening new corridors which we would go down. I remember feeling like I was not able to come back to the realm of the living, but I was not able to move on to heaven either. I was stuck in that place of impossibly long corridors, accompanied by these orderlies that rarely even show signs that they even knew I was there. I would freak out and scream at them only to be ignored. I would cry and beg for them to let me know what was happening to me, but somehow I knew they weren't allowed to tell me anything. Finally, frustrated and afraid, I resigned myself to their care, having faith that the Lord would see me through this ordeal, or that, live or die, it was in His hands. I spent day after day like this until I went to sleep strapped in the gurney and finally awoke in a hospital bed, not tied up, but unable to walk or use my left arm at all. The nurse asked me if I knew where I was, and after hearing that so many times from the orderlies, I cried that, "No, I do not." The nurse asked me the year, and I said 2020. She said no, that it was 2021, and asked if I knew where I was. Terrified, remembering the orderlies, I cried, "No, I do not." She told me that I was in recovery at a hospital in Bountiful, and that I was going to be okay. It took me 2 more months of getting pushed in my wheelchair to the gym, where I worked out for 3 hours a day until I could use my left arm and walk on my own again. I know that God has a plan for me, and that I'm here for a reason. I'm staying in a homeless shelter in Salt Lake City. I lost the apartment for having unauthorized people staying with me. But after the coma, terrified to sleep or not have somebody there with me. I've told my story truthfully and exactly as I remember what happened. This girl used to stay in the house as mine, but on an above floor. One night the warden called all of us boys upstairs, and we saw her possessed, like literally. She was lying in bed and growling and occasionally screaming. It's like in the movies, but not as dramatic. We boys pinned her down, but she was too strong for us. She murmured in a completely different language, and this went on for 10 minutes or so. It was very confusing. Our warden kept saying, "Please leave the body of this girl." Eventually she became normal, but as soon as it felt like the spirit had left her body, another girl started screaming and panicking, and she lost consciousness as the possessed girl gained consciousness. When we called a pundit later, he said that spirits usually try and take weak spirits after they leave one body. We took the other girl to the hospital, and she gained consciousness later. Now, I didn't know the girl personally, but I knew her from my friends. She was apparently on some mental health-related medication. and she hadn't taken her pills that day. So, a logical explanation would be that her condition just worsened and it led to that. But I noticed two very strange things about her. One was that she was speaking in a completely different language. It was very archaic and Nepali language. Since I'm Nepali and I could understand a few words. I think she tried to say something like, "Why did you all do this?" Something like that. She, in her normal state, didn't know how to speak in Nepali. Secondly, she was very strong when she was in that possessed state. There were 4 of us and a few others were also holding her. We tried to pin her down, but she overpowered us. We managed to control her, but not at times when she was violently swinging her body. At one point, she banged her hand very hard against a wall, and I'm sure she must have hurt, but she didn't show any signs of pain. The pundit said that it was an ancient spirit. She left the hostel after that, and that was the last time we heard of her. I think about that day often. Ghost encounter? Back in '98, my best friend Jessica and I were really into ghosts and gore. We would have her dad rent Faces of Death on the weekend camp out at her house and just indulge. Working at the video store was your typical video store employee back in the '90s. Late 20s, single, lives with mom. He and his mom lived in the neighborhood for quite a while, so we all had the stories. We would spend hours in the video store looking over videos and conversing with Jim. Jim had all the neighborhood stories. There was this house at the end of the street, closer to Jessica's house, that constantly had families moving in and out. All short stays, no longer than a year. Our high school bus was directly in front of this house. The longest tenants in the home were a gothic kid and his older mom. They stayed for the better part of a year. While at the video store one day, Jim tells us the story of the house at our bus stop and why no one seems to be able to live in it for an extended amount of time. Story goes there's a party in the house back in the 70s, and supposedly a woman was decapitated, wrapped in the carpet, and relocated. Needless to say, my friend and I must investigate. By this time, the house was empty again. She spends the night at my house, and we plan to sneak out in the middle of the night to check it out. The time comes. It's 2 or 3 in the morning. Jess and I, for whatever reason, crawl on all 4s down the street until we are a safe distance from my house, enter the house through the backyard, past the pool used as a restroom, and proceeded into the house through the kitchen. The kitchen area is an empty floor plan attached to the living room with a bathroom and bedrooms breaking off. We were being real disrespectful. I can't recall what we were doing or saying, but it wasn't nice. We walked into the bathroom closet in the kitchen and started to smell this horrid stench, something along the lines of rotting meat. We walk into the bathroom and all of a sudden this bright green orb comes shooting out of the toilet, headed straight toward us. We screamed and ran out the back door from which we came. Past the swimming pool and past the window of the bathroom we just ran out of. The entire bathroom was illuminated by a bright green color, and we ran our asses back to my house, never to go back. What the fuck was that? Nightmares and dreams about a dead loved one. I think it all started a month or 2 after he passed. I'd have nightmares about him rotting away and looking worse than what the cancer did to him. He'd act like himself, but no one in the dream thought it was him. He was suffering so much in the dreams, but would never die. Even when he did, he would always come back. No matter what he did, he would suffer. I think my brain still thought he was in pain and he was hiding somewhere. In these dreams, I never thought this was him. I had these nightmares once a week, about 3 to 5 times. I finally told my grandma about this, and she said not to accept them, that it was my grandpa and that he wasn't suffering anymore. She sent me pictures of him being happy, and I looked at them before I went to sleep. I had the nightmare again, but this time I was aware that it was a dream. I asked him why this was happening, and he just said it was for a reason, and then I woke up. I dreaded having it again and tried to think about all the happy memories. They stopped for 2 weeks, and then it happened again. I was back at my grandparents' house. I was looking for my grandpa, but I didn't see him. I went downstairs, and it was a lot more calm and bright instead of creepy and dark. Some family members were down there watching TV, and I noticed how blank the walls looked. He was there, and instead of opening his mouth to talk, thoughts would just enter my mind. He taught me how to paint the walls. It was a passion of his, and it was something I'd never learned before. It just seemed so much like him, and my mom confirmed that all the things he taught me was correct. The nightmares definitely could have been the grief, and the dream could have been something I had learned before and forgot, but I don't remember that at all. That dream made me really happy, though. I've been wishing that I get more like that. It really felt like he was there. I hope this brought comfort to some people. My friends and I think a church is haunted. It started when our private school rented the top of a church building in a pretty sketchy city in Washington state. It was very exciting for us because we've basically been homeschooling the whole time, and this new area would be perfect to kickstart progress for our school. We didn't notice anything in the start, and it seemed like a steal renting out the top floor because of how much room there was. We couldn't rent the first floor because the church was using it, but it had the only bathrooms in the building, so we were allowed to go down and use it. We had this bathroom buddy system, where there has to be at least 2 people going down to the bathrooms, no less. This system was to ensure the safety of students, because the area had a lot of homeless people, and our school manager didn't want to take any chances. Okay, this is where the creepy stuff starts. My brother had to use the bathroom, so I agreed to go downstairs with him and wait outside the bathroom. My brother was in the bathroom, and I decided to sit down at the table. There was this open meeting area. I was utterly alone in that open area, and then out of nowhere, I hear footsteps all around me. The patterns were spontaneous, and I was sure that there were no people downstairs with me. I heard the floorboards creaking, which made it even more chilling. Thankfully, my brother came out of the bathroom and told him about what happened. He recalled hearing the same thing whenever he would wait outside a bathroom for other people. We both agreed that something fishy was going on, but we decided to brush it off because we needed to catch up on school. First thing was bone chilling, but we had other things to do, so we forgot about it. My brother then told me about this time when he had to go downstairs to the bathroom with a friend, and what he told me shocked me, hearing about the other things we've witnessed. Before I tell you this, I need you to know about the way we get down to the bathrooms. In order to go to the bathrooms, you need to take the dark and creepy stairwell that takes you to the even darker and creepier hallway. This hallway leads you to the nursery, and from the nursery to the bathrooms. My brother told me that when he went through the nursery, he saw that one of the baby cradles was rocking by itself. This definitely spooked me, and I started getting suspicious of the building. Fast forward about a year, and we're moving out of the building. We've decided to move to the church across from the bigger church, and this time, we are renting the whole building. This new church had a much more welcoming vibe, and you felt a lot safer. Something I forgot to mention about the past building is that the lights would keep going out, and the power would constantly shut off. This new building would feel very warm. It had a more stable electrical output, and you didn't get very strange feelings. I'd get back to that later. Anyway, since we were moving buildings, we'd obviously have to move stuff from the old one to the new one. This is where the creepy stuff started happening. Now that the building was empty, in the sense of being devoid of people, you had a very strong sense of dread and eeriness. Every hallway you would pass, you'd feel like you were being watched in the darkness. The building was also much colder than before, and some rooms were perfectly normal and warm, but others would have a cold and dark presence. My friends and I knew exactly what was going on and what we were going to do. Explore. My friend group consisted of 3 other people, one being my brother. So all in all, we only had a force of 4 people. We were exploring, and we decided to go down that creepy stairwell with our phone flashlights. This is where a lot of the stuff started. When we went down, it was only one other kid and I, my brother, and the other friend decided to stay back up. We were going down the hallway, and I got an overwhelming feeling of being watched from the darkness. There was an exit door next to the bottom of the stairs, and I keep looking at it. I felt as though there was some sort of presence coming from there, staring at our souls. We tried to open the door to the nursery, but it was locked. It seems to be locked from the other side, possibly from the church locking it, which was a very plausible explanation. My other friend and I decided that we should go back up because the overwhelming sense of dread was too much for us at the time, and we started to packing things up. There were a lot more things happening, but I'll have to tell the main things building up to this point. When we were loading stuff into the car, my other friend told us to come back to look at something. So we were all marching up the stairs from the outside. This was another entrance into the building. And asked him what it was. He told us that he heard talking all the way from the creepy stairwell in the back of the building. And just as he heard that, a chain that was present in the room started swinging from side to side. This obviously freaked us all out, and we decided to pick up the pace and started packing things up. In this situation, our curiosity got the best of us, and we took that opportunity by using the bathroom. We used another entrance to get to the bathroom without having to go through the locked nursery door. When we were going to the bathroom, my friend brought a radio to see if we could pick up some signals. Now, usually, we'd use radios to listen to police channels and hear if there was a chase going on. But this time, my friend was trying to see if he could pick up ghost readings, which I thought was pretty much impossible. Something happened to his radio, though. The battery went from 3 bars to 0. This shocked us because we all learned that ghosts or spirits can drain the battery usage on most items. Though that wasn't the only strange thing that happened. That day, we had to carry some drawers down the creepy flight of stairs, through the creepier hallway, to the cradle-swinging nursery. We accepted the offer and started carrying the drawer to the locked nursery door. From the side it was locked. My friend had the key, so we unlocked it. I vividly remember having to unlock the door and get the drawer upstairs, then lock the door. The next day, something crazy would happen. The next day, my friends would decide to go down the stairs into the creepy hallway, but one of them chickened out. I mean, I don't blame him. We have encountered some crazy things, but he was very persistent in staying behind. We let him leave, and so we went on down the hallway. That gave me the creeps. I got that feeling of being watched again, and I was getting nervous. But then, something my friend said caught my attention. The door to the nursery is unlocked. I couldn't really believe what I was hearing. I remember having to lock the door when going through. That meant someone or something had to have unlocked it from the other side. We were leaving the hallway quickly, and during that, I heard some sort of low-pitched groaning that could have been a door opening or closing. Both of the ideas were just as disturbing because we were alone in the building. A few hours of packing passed, and we were finishing up the job. We were sitting around planning to pick up a bookshelf when we heard footsteps coming from the creepy stairs. Thankfully, the door was closed, but we decided it was best to just move the bookshelf quickly and get out of there. We were leaving. We also heard faint, inaudible talking coming from that door. That was the last time we ever went to the church building, but I'm glad we never opened that door again. I used to experience it a lot, like a couple times a year before I moved about 17 years ago. Haven't really experienced it since. A little bit of an explanation of what I perceived as the dark. In addition to the sensation of cold I described above, It was like when you look at a bright light for too long, and then you get kind of that shadowy look in part of your field of vision where the light source overstimulated your retina, except the dark was on a fixed point, whereas the lamp would alter your vision in a fixed range of view that moved as your head and eyes moved. I felt it more often than not before I saw it. It came at me in radiant waves that are hard to describe. Like, have you ever stepped somewhere at night perhaps, and the ground or the stair or the floor wasn't quite where you were expecting it to be? There's that fraction of a second before your foot makes contact and your brain is like, this isn't right, abort, abort. And that's kind of like what it felt like to be around the dark for me. Looking at it just wasn't something I enjoyed doing, so I would avoid looking at it and avoid being around it. My friend's description of cold suffices, but it wasn't cold. Like, I'd often get goosebumps and shivers, but they didn't really correspond with how cold I felt. Sometimes I can recall experiencing the dark growing up. I lived on a farm about 30-minute walk from the town center. About 20 minutes of that was past street lamps. And then it was a faster walk to the railroad tracks than the streets. So I'd see it in the fields on the walk home at night. Moonlight made it easier for me, but I said, you could feel it even if you couldn't see it. These encounters were unnerving, but it never got close enough to make me run. Those were also 95% of the experience I had with it. At church, I experienced it in the sanctuary of my home church. It's probably the only time that I felt that it was truly maleficent. And it's the only time I saw it move. Rather, it was occupying one location. I turned away, and then it was occupying another location nearer to me when I looked back. I have a friend who shared this experience with me. I'll see if I can get her to add her account. In the hallway of the school, as mentioned before, there were more people that experienced it. So, as creepy as it was, it kind of felt good to know that it wasn't just me hallucinating. One day my mom was sick with something like a bad cold, so she ended up sleeping in my room, while I went over to my parents' room to sleep in their bed with my dad, sort of like a not very effective quarantine. Maybe it was to distract me, or maybe he was feeling generous, but that night my dad decided to let me do a Halo 2 marathon with him. Knowing that my mom would disapprove if she stumbled in, I went over to lock the bedroom door. My dad found that idea funny and let it slide, and soon we were off slaying virtual aliens. Eventually, after a few hours, we both decided to call it a night and went to sleep. I woke up blurry-eyed in the morning, wondering what time it was. Not a moment later, the door suddenly swung open on its own. Aside from the creaky door hinge, the house was silent, not even a whisper of breeze through the air. My dad sat up in bed next to me, apparently having woken up about the same time. We glanced at each other, then back at the open doorway. I crawled out of bed and inspected the door. The handle was locked and stiff, just like I'd left it the night before. My mom's snores confirming she wasn't the cause either. To this day, neither Dad nor I know exactly how or why the door opened on its own. The story's not that creepy, but the house itself always had a tingling sensation on the back of my neck. I doubt anyone is reading this, but I do have another story. This one is either a nightmare or a case of sleep paralysis. This happened about 3 or 4 years ago. I was in the hospital following a surgery for my scoliosis, so I was also pretty doped up on painkillers. My dad, being such a great dad, decided to regale me with tales of all the children that probably died in my hospital room or even in my bed. My mom ended up shooting him away so I could go to sleep. She decided to stay that night at the hospital since I needed help just to roll onto my side and sit up. I slept peacefully at first, but sometime through the night I woke up in a half-awake state. Usually in times like this, I'm awake enough to be able to lucid dream afterwards. As I thought of what the dream I might want to have, a stray thought crossed my mind. What about a scary dream? No, that would be bad. Think happy thoughts. It was a futile effort. The more I tried thinking about a more happy idea, the negative thoughts snowballed, and soon I was hearing a flurry of voices, almost like 1,000 children whispering to me. I tried to jerk my head away, but to my horror, I couldn't even move. My eyes flicked to the side to see my sleeping mom, but on my other side, instead of the IV stand, I only saw an aura of darkness. The shadow began to grow, blocking out my vision as the whispering increased in intensity, creating a pressure over my chest. I could feel the weight of the whispering children pressing down, my frantic breathing growing shorter and harder until I could no longer breathe at all. The darkness quickly overwhelmed me, and all I saw was black. Presumably, I just passed out after that. The next morning I woke up completely fine. Based on what I read about sleep paralysis, my experience seems similar, and I've definitely had many episodes of sleep paralysis since then. Funnily enough, these happened often enough during the last year, my thoughts turned from just look away from the dark figure to hurry up, goddammit, and get this over with so I can move my neck. I've been diagnosed by several doctors with an undefined sleep disorder. Effectively, they don't know what it is. It most closely resembles something like hypnotic nightmares, but that isn't it. Anyway, the condition causes me to hallucinate and see disturbing things. It occurs in a sort of waking state, but because it's been happening for going on 20 years, I've gotten to the point to where I just get annoyed and wake myself up when it happens. It isn't terribly frequent, but it does still happen. The thing is, it only ever happens in my bedroom back at my parents' house. I'm a skeptic to my core, physics major, obsessed with all things scientific. The house is like 30 years old and was built by a neighbor, who also lived in it before we did. Nothing tragic, no Indian burial ground. It's a nice suburb. One night my girlfriend at the time was in bed sound asleep with me. I wake up to a loud crash. She's fallen on the floor and screaming, wide awake, staring ahead, and scrambling backwards. She doesn't even think to get me. She's terrified. I immediately rush to get in between her and whatever she's yelling at. What I saw, about 10 feet away, was a low shadow, maybe the size of a Rottweiler, with no distinct shape that I can recall. It grew rapidly, and it was either getting closer or simply growing. As soon as she noticed I was there, she seemed to snap out of it. When I looked back, the thing was gone. More likely, I woke up and stopped hallucinating when she did. Except she doesn't have a condition. She never had a nightmare in the 5 years we were together. She was bawling her eyes out for close to 20 minutes. Afterwards, I ended up staying awake for most of the night. I'd like to think that she just had a nightmare for the first time I've seen. And I reacted to it, but I can tell you, it wasn't the same as things I generally see. When I lived with my parents and worked in retail, I had an early morning shift. I started at 6 a.m. and I'd be home by 12 p.m. Since both my parents worked and my sister was still in high school, I would usually have the house to myself for a while once I got home from work. I came home to an empty house as usual and plopped my ass down for post-work shit. I would do this with the door open since no one was home. As I was browsing Reddit and delivering my package, I heard the laundry room door open and close. The way the house was set up, you had to go through the laundry room to get into the garage. The door that led from the laundry room to the garage was very heavy and always made a loud sound that would vibrate the house when it was closed. It also made a sticking sound when you opened it. I heard the door make its sticking noise to open and then the loud noise of it closing. Figuring that one of my parents came home early or something, I slapped the bathroom door closed partway and yelled, "Hello!" But there was no response. We had creaky wood floors at the time, so anytime anybody walked through the house, it would make loud, audible creaks and cracking sounds. I heard the wood creaking and groaning as someone walked a few feet into the living room, and then the sound stopped. I did notice, however, that there was no sound of shoes on the floor, just the creaking. I figured either my mom or dad walked over to the carpeted area in the living room where you couldn't hear footsteps and sat on the couch. I yelled out again to no response. I finished wiping my ass and left the bathroom to go greet whoever it was, and there was no one there. That's when I started getting a bad feeling. It was literally impossible to walk across the floor without someone hearing it. I would know. I learned this by trying to sneak out many times in high school. You couldn't hide that noise if you wanted to, and especially not if you just had come home from work and didn't have a reason to sneak around. I would have 100% heard someone walk out of the living room and into another bedroom or into the kitchen. I checked everywhere. The kitchen, my bedroom, my sister's bedroom, my parents' bedroom, my dad's office, the patio, the garage, nobody. There wasn't a soul in sight. The door leading from the laundry room to the garage was unlocked, but we always left it unlocked. Theoretically, someone could have broken in, heard me yell, then left through the same door. But there was no physical way to close the door silently or muffle their footsteps as they left the house. The garage door was also closed, and the door on the side of the garage was also locked, so they wouldn't have been able to leave through there. I called both of my parents just to be safe, and neither of them said that they had been to the house since they left that morning. They were both miles and miles away from home. This really made me feel uneasy, and I snuck up off to the room to try to forget the whole incident. I told them what happened when they got home, and they agreed that it sounded weird, but there was no signs of forced entry or anything stolen, so we couldn't do anything about it. I had a few other creepy incidences in that house over 21 years that I lived there, but this is the one that stood out the most by far. Years ago, when I was a teenager and still living at home, a 200-year-old house in a medieval town, I was playing PlayStation in a good sitting room. We weren't allowed to eat food or wear shoes in that room. I was totally into my game. And then my little brother plodded in, really stomping his feet, shoes on, and crunching on what I assumed to be a packet of crisps, no food allowed. He sat in the chair to my right. I didn't take my eye off the game, but saw the movement from the outer of my eye. He kept crunching, and I shouted to him to get out. With that, he got up and stomped back out. A while later, when my game was finished, I went downstairs and gave out about him to my mother. I told how he was doing his best to make me lose my game by being really annoying, crunching crisps really loudly. She looked at me like I was crazy. Then she told me that he wasn't home since morning. He was at his best friend's house. I can still hear the crunching, and I can still see him out of the corner of my eye. It was so clear. There was somebody there. I also experienced pokes in my back while I tried to sleep. I heard someone on the stairs, but no one there. Things that would often be moved around, but no one had moved them, that sort of thing. Fast forward to several years ago. Roadworks were taking place, and outside the house they discovered a medieval skeleton of a child. They believed she was sacrificed as she was facing the sea. It was not within the abbey boundaries. The house is an old abbey, and was posed. She is still there, and they believe she's probably one of many. I have several stories, so I'll make them as short as possible. Here's story 1. When I was 7, my great-grandpa died of natural causes. Now keep in mind, I was a total slob as a child, never cleaning up after myself. I wake up one day in a half-asleep daze, a few weeks after the funeral. I see my great-grandpa putting away all of my clean clothes that were on the floor the night before. He says to me, "Hey, sweetie, go back to bed, I'm just cleaning." I wake up a second time a few hours later, walk over to where he was standing, and see all my clothes that were on the floor neatly put away in my dresser. I asked my mom if she put away my clothes. She said no, and her jaw dropped. Story 2. When I was 8, my cousin died from a collision with a semi as her car lost control on black ice. About a month or so passes, and I'm put in grief counseling because my young brain couldn't process such an early, violent death. One morning at my grandma's, again I wake up in a half-asleep daze, and she's on her knees on the floor smiling at me. She said, "When you're ready, I have the kids' table set up for some tea, okay?" I don't remember if or how I reacted, but I blinked and she was gone. I didn't go back to sleep this time. The kids' table was set up in cups and pretend drinks and teapots. I asked my grandma if she did this. She said no. Story 3. This one is more tame, but still freaked me out. My dad died when I was 19, and his ashes were separated between me, my sister, and my brother. Maybe a week into having his ashes and lights in my apartment, they start to flicker nonstop. We tried changing the bulbs, calling maintenance to fix it, but nothing worked. I texted my sister and asked if she had anything weird happened since receiving his ashes. She said she had the same problem with her lights and that she'd never experienced in her house. Now I know it's frowned upon to contact the dead, but the flickering light was annoying me to no end. I said out loud, "If you're here, Dad, could you please give me any other sign that doesn't involve messing with my shit?" I got a knock on my bedroom door at 2 a.m. I was home alone, and the security footage showed no sign of a break-in. Story 4. My mom's house is haunted as well. We've had a ghost since we moved in there, when I was a kid. There's a very clear footstep coming from the upstairs all the time, and this asshole of a ghost likes to slam open and shut our kitchen cupboards. When I was around 7 years old, I woke up in the middle of the night because I thought I heard loud noises in the house. I walked out of my room and glanced down the long hallway where I could see the street light shining through the window into the kitchen floor. I rubbed my eyes and saw what appeared to be my younger brother standing just beyond the beam of light in the shadow. I walked toward him to see what was going on, and as I got closer and closer, it became more and more clear that this small boy was not my brother at all. It was standing there super still, head tilted and just staring at me with these piercing dark eyes that I'll never ever forget. I ran straight into my parents' room as fast as I could and slept in their bed that night. I never brought it up to them, and I did my best to try and forget it. I think I almost convinced myself that I made it up in my head. Fast forward several years later, and I'm a senior in high school hanging out with my then girlfriend. My brother and a few of his friends at his house. It was dark and storming outside, and the power had just gone out. I decided to light a candle, put it in the middle of us that we were all laying and talking on the floor. Someone randomly suggested that we tell ghost stories, and I immediately thought about my encounter 10 years prior. I said, "Guys, I'm going to tell you something that I've never told a single soul. I saw something many years ago right here in this very house, and I don't give a fuck if you believe me or not. I 100% saw something paranormal right over there, actually," pointing over to the kitchen. Before I could even start my story, my brother goes, "Wait a second, are you serious?" I glanced over at him confused as to why he had interrupted me. He then looked me dead in the eyes, his face distressed and turning a little bit white. Did you happen to see a little boy?" My jaw dropped and I was at a complete loss for words. Everyone around us immediately started freaking out too because they instantly grasped that we had both seen the same thing. I still get goosebumps thinking about it. Probably about 10 years ago now, I was dating a girl for a few years. I once brought her over. We were going to stay the night at my parents' house and go to breakfast with them in the morning for a thing that I can't really remember. We got to their house pretty late, probably 11 p.m. Get out of the car and she stops and looks toward the backyard. I look at her and she asks me if my parents had a dog that was out. I say no and ask her why. My parents had small dogs, which were happily inside and not biting my ankles. So she describes a large black dog that ran through the backyard, ran through overgrown grass and then behind the shed. The thing is, she'd never seen my parents' yard before. It was in rural Florida. The grass next to the shed was overgrown because they had giant rocks lined up. Nothing could run through that. And more importantly, they had a fence that couldn't easily be opened and never was opened just out of view. The dog she described as large and black matched the description of an old family dog of which I never once described to her. The dog was buried behind that shed. Also, never once described to her that. I'm pretty sure she was haunted in general. For another thing that nobody asked for, when we lived together, her house was haunted. Taps, knocks, and pounds through the entire house, on any wall and sometimes table and doors too. But only near us. Loud, one thump in the wall, taps on the wall following us down the hallway. I hated it. Her brother also lived with us, who never once heard anything of the sort. I distinctly remember us talking about it in bed late one night, but we heard just one big thump on the wall directly behind us in bed. I didn't like that either. The same night she stayed over at my parents' house, we started hearing tapping on the walls around us, which is something that has never happened in that house. Honestly, thinking about it still gives me goosebumps. The thing about paranormal experiences, you gotta live it to believe it. That's what happened to me. I had this experience in 2016 when I visited Mel, my cousin's home. I was dropping off her mom at home. Since it was a long drive, it started getting dark, and they asked me to stay over. Next morning, I woke up late, and Mel served us breakfast and told me her mom and she were going to the local market, and her husband is gone to attend an emergency work. So she told me to lock the doors. So I locked the doors and turned on the heater and went to get some towels in the guest room. When I came back, the switch was turned off. I thought it was faulty switches. That was the only logical explanation when you had no belief in paranormal activity. So I switched it on again and I entered the shower and locked the door. Halfway through the shower, I heard something, and it was like something locking the bathroom doors from outside, and it freaked me out. And I tried to open the doors, and it was locked from the outside, so I started banging at the door and shouting that I have a phone and I'll call the cops if they don't leave. A few seconds later, the door just opened itself with no lock sound, so I rushed out and checked the house for any intruders. All doors and windows were closed, except the front main window, which had crossbars. There's no way someone could enter through that, except for a cat. I came to the conclusion that the door could have just been stuck, so I let it pass despite the fact I heard something locking it from the outside. 20 minutes later, Mel and her mom returned and told me to stay over because it's the weekend and she was planning to cook ribs, so I stayed over. In the evening around 3:25, Jeff came home. Later, we were sitting in the patio and discussing about random topics. Mel went in to check on the ribs, and I hear her voice calling, "Mom." So I turned right to her mom, and I saw Mel sitting beside her mom. And I was still hearing Mel's voice clearly from inside the house, and I was completely frozen for a second. I panicked and I said, "Did y'all hear that?" Jeff said, "Just don't acknowledge it or respond to it and it'll stop." I was totally freaked and I responded, "What the fuck was that?" Mel said that sometimes we hear voices or some paranormal activities happening around the house, but it didn't occur frequently. I was like, "What the fuck, for reals? You're telling me something unexplainable is happening around you and you're okay with that?" Jeff told me that there are around 12 to 15 bodies found in the lake during the 90s before they moved in. That lake is right behind the house, in 30 meters, and the previous owner of the house had a priest who involved in exorcism activities, which they came to know about only later. Mel's in-law bought the property in 2003 without any knowledge about it. Mel and Jeff moved in around 2009 after refurbishment. Jeff said something that they would see a small girl in a white frock giggling and running in the house, and he assured me nothing harmful has ever happened to them through the years, though. The moment you find something beyond your understanding is happening, and it'll completely fuck you up. I was around 21 at that time since that incident. I had the feeling of someone following me in the dark or someone constantly watching me. I had to take medication and do mental exercises for 3 years and tried to keep myself around friends or family at all times. Once upon a time, I lived on South Beach, Miami, and worked at a local alternative clothing store right on the main strip. One day in the middle of summer, I was at work with the store owner there with me. It was the slow season, and customers were scarce. So she made herself busy dressing mannequins on one side of the store, while I sat folding t-shirts behind a display case on the other side. It was boring to say the least, but at one point the owner interrupted me to ask if I had seen her kids come through. They lived upstairs, so this would not have been unusual. However, I had not, and told her so. When I asked her why, she said she could have sworn she heard some kids laughing and talking somewhere in the store. But I hadn't heard a damn thing. So she went back to her task, obviously confused. I went back to work folding clothes and thought nothing more of it. All was still, quiet, and completely unremarkable for the next 10 minutes or so, until a sudden movement in the corner of my eye caught my attention. I then turned to look just in time to see my bottle of vitamin water launch itself from where it was sitting on top of the display case and slam into the wall 5 feet behind it and spill all over the floor. No joke. That fucker flew into the wall like it had been hit by a baseball bat, hard enough to hit a home run. To say that I was perplexed would be an understatement. I sat there frozen and stared at the mess as I struggled to comprehend what had just happened. I would have seen if someone threw it, and no one was around, not a damn soul. But it wasn't physically possible, right? My brain felt like it was going to short circuit. A few moments later, I was still staring stupidly at the mess when the owner walked up to check on me. "Is everything all right?" she asked, when she saw what had happened. I didn't know what to say, but I think I mumbled something about a bottle getting knocked off the counter, and told her that I'd clean it up right away. Satisfied but still confused, she shrugged and walked away. Now this is the thought that was really wild. If you've ever seen a vitamin water cap before, you know it's made of hard, thick plastic that's nearly impossible to break without a tool of some kind. So whatever quantum force decided to make an example out of my bottle that day had to have been especially powerful, because the impact it made against the wall split the cap clean through the center, sending both pieces flying in opposite directions before they hit the floor. I'm just glad I wasn't in the way. So yeah, take it from me. Poltergeists don't fuck around. I've had a few, but this one is the only one I can't explain in some reasonable way. It was late at night, but my cousin and I decided to go to our grandparents' house. We both lived about a 3-minute walking distance from them, so we walked. We live in different houses, but we're close. He told me he will be late. So, I'll be alone. As soon as I left my house, I saw smoke moving from left to right. It was behind the building across from me, so I didn't see when it went right. I thought it was just the wind due to the fact that it was winter and many people were heating up their houses, so smoke came from there. But as it crossed the street, a fear took over me. It stopped me dead in my tracks. I looked up and saw the smoke again, but it was going against the wind and it was looking like it was jumping on the house. It didn't float, it was leaping toward me. It was steel on the roof and it was getting closer. I just started running. I ran to my grandparents' house, but I could still see it from the corner of my eye, leaping from house to house. I was a few houses away from my destination when I'd lost it. I couldn't see it, but as I looked up to my grandparents' house, I saw a blue orb-like thing on top of it. It was just moving on the roof, and I froze from fear. I was just looking up at it. Then I felt something grab my leg. The neighbor has let out his puppy and it squeezed through the fence just to jump on my leg. I was so happy to see him. I think that's when I realized I wasn't alone. When I locked up at the house again, the orb was gone, and I ran into the house. I was shaking from fear and my grandma had to calm me down. But what really scared me was when my cousin walked in. His face was so white I knew something was up. He told us that there was an orb on the roof, but he had just ran past it. That was something that scared me the most. It was still there.